When you're out there, you've got a race course that's 3,000 miles long by 2,000 miles wide. You can move within it strategically however you want. The weather, which dictates every strategic decision you make, you don't know what's coming with any real accuracy more than about 4 days in advance. You've got this continually evolving strategy that's incredibly reactive. At the same time, you know, the threat of real physical danger to our bodies is ever present. And we're in this high-performance yacht race, you know, this high-stakes, you know, high-profile race, always trying to outmaneuver, outperform, strategize our opponents. All these things that put people in a very psychologically unsafe space. So it was the team that was going to be able to create a culture around that and allow people to sort of perform at their best 24 hours a day for 10 long months was going to do really well in this event. So I want to share a story with you from one of the early stages of the race. This is one of the most powerful learnings that I took from the whole experience. And I think it's something that's going to resonate with you because the world that you're facing is very much akin to the one I was, with disruption, constant change, and big uncertainty, particularly with what's happening right now. So take a look at this. We leave Rio de Janeiro on our second long leg of the race, racing to Cape Town, South Africa. Now, the fastest way to get from Rio to Cape Town isn't to sail directly there. It's to dive south, head towards the Southern Ocean, to pick up the northern boundary of those big, low-pressure systems that spin around the bottom of the globe, and they sort of catapult you across the South Atlantic to Cape Town. Now, we're 10 days into that leg, and we've just had our first big disaster of the race. A huge crash jibe wipeout in 45 knots of wind, just like you saw before, the whole boat thrown over onto its side. The boom, that 400-kilo piece of alloy that sits just above our heads, swung across the deck like a woodsman's axe swinging at a tree, slammed into the rigging on the other side. The two pieces of rope that are designed to stop that from happening, with a combined breaking strain of 16 tons, snapped like parcel string. It was the middle of the night. We tore to shreds our two most important sails, done some bad damage to the equipment on the boat, narrowly avoided what would have been a fatal injury. This is in the middle of the night in this huge seaway, the boat just over on its side, shouting, confusion, head torches shining. I shot up onto the deck, did the world's fastest head count. I remember the panic in that moment and the relief when I knew that everyone was still attached to the boat and no one was injured. Now, we had an embedded cameraman with us on this leg, making a documentary. And what he saw in the moments after that, I'll never forget, and I want to share with you now. Now, if you'd gone back to before the race and you'd asked me and my team, are you a resilient team? Are you a resilient leader, Brendan? I would have said, of course we are. Of course I am. It's one of my strengths. So with that in mind, just have a little look and notice the level of resilience that's on display right here.
Probably about as bad a night as you can imagine for a sailing skipper. We're just going to ride it out until morning. We've basically stopped racing. We're out of this race for now. We just don't deserve this. Can't believe this race is over for us.
But Spirit of Australia's problems don't end there. For 3 days and nights, they're battered mercilessly. And then, just when they feel things can't get any worse, they suffer a second, more serious crash jibe.
We don't deserve this. We really don't deserve this. 3 nights in a row, 3 disasters. I don't know what we've done, but it's just so frustrating for me and for everybody. We didn't need another knock to our confidence. So,
I know what you're thinking. Like Churchill without the cigar. What a strong-jawed, kind of steely-eyed, resolute response. I mean, when the cameraman, he showed me this piece of footage in the little viewfinder of his camera, it took my breath away. Because I wouldn't self-identify as one of those people who kind of speak in that kind of defeatist, victim kind of way. I don't actually remember much of what happened that night. It was all just a confusion of getting the boat sorted out and getting everything safe, and we carried on till morning. But what I do remember was the next day. Now, we had a daily meeting every single day on this boat at 12 o'clock, all the crew up on deck, and I was saying the same kinds of things the next day. I remember saying, we don't deserve this. This is sort of unfair. What have we done, universe, to bring this bad karma on ourselves? And you know what? The shadow that I was casting as the leader of that team, it was becoming the sentiment amongst the crew. There were other people kind of reflecting that language back at me. And the conversation was kind of going down the plug hole. Until one of my crew, it was a really quiet chap, a radiologist in his life. I lost that. He spoke up, and he wasn't someone that really spoke up in these meetings, and he said, right, everyone stop, just stop. I can't bear it to hear us talking to each other and ourselves like this. I can't bear it. And he said, I've got something that I think could help us, kind of put some salve on this wound we're feeling. I read it in a book about a year ago. There's something called growth mindset. Has anyone heard of it here? Most people have. If you're on LinkedIn, you're seeing stuff about growth mindset on the daily. Back then, the book had just been written. None of us had ever heard of it. And so he said it just like this. He said, so growth mindset is this idea that bad stuff's going to happen. You can't always avoid it. You can't always get out of its way. Given the inherent risks of what we're doing and the length of time we're out here doing it, we've got to look at events like this as being sort of statistically inevitable. And how we respond to them is the really important bit. And we've got to make sure that rather than just sort of wallowing like we have done, we learn a lesson and we make sure it never happens again and we don't find ourselves in this situation again. And I could tell the minute he said it, there were like nodding heads around the group. The body language changed. And people were thinking, yeah, that is exactly the conversation we need to be having right now. What can we learn from these last 3 days of unremitting hell to stop us ever finding ourselves here again? And it started this wide-ranging conversation around the crew on the deck of this boat as we sort of limped along. And I remember I was there listening, and then I kind of tuned out a little bit, sort of retreated inwards a little bit, and I realized that I'd made a big assumption about this race that was wrong, was incorrect, and was now being challenged. Yes, I think I'd correctly seen this race, as I'd been told, as a race of 10 teams rather than a race of 10 yachts. But there were 10 identical teams with identical starting resources, broadly following the same strategy, going through the same experiences at around the same kinds of times, and sort of generally getting better and upskilling and learning at the same rate. But it was then I realized that's not how this race works, and that's not how life works generally. Just going through an experience like that doesn't necessarily mean you learn anything from it, you take anything from it, certainly nothing that's going to stop it from happening again. That's a very deliberate practice. We don't learn from our experiences, we learn from reflecting on our experiences. And that's one thing, it's an easy thing to do when it's, maybe a mistake we've made personally, there's no one else around and we can reflect on it, in the confines of our own mind and sort of learn a little lesson there. But when a team is involved, a group of people, that involves a conversation, and that involves sometimes what can be a very hard conversation, things like trust, competence being questioned, people feeling like they've let the team down, blameworthiness creeping in. It can be a hard place to go. But that was what we had to do. We had to, discuss these things and make sure that we learned a lesson from them each time. And we made a vow to each other on the deck of the boat that day that we were only going to learn the hard lessons once. Sounds really cheesy, but it worked. By the end of the race, that became our single biggest competitive advantage. So we limped on, we sailed on into Cape Town, we arrived in 7th place. Now I thought we were going to be dead last for sure, but there were other boats that were damaged even worse than we were in the bad weather. And after a few days for the crew to kind of go away and reflect on everything, we repaired the boat and just sort of decompress, we all got back together in this little meeting room above the bar, the yacht club in Cape Town. And we had our debrief on the leg that we'd just had. And in the meantime, we've been doing all this research, reading about growth mindset. I really had latched onto this idea, and I wanted us to do it for real. What I wanted in this meeting was for us to kind of rewind the tape narratively to the very start of the race, go through all the kind of lessons and experiences that we'd had, all these kind of key moments where maybe we hadn't learned a lesson. We just kind of swept it aside, okay, refocus, guys, carry on. We'll make sure we do better next time. And go back and make sure we learn those lessons. Bring us up to the present moment where we could do it sort of in real time going forward. And I told the crew that's what we were going to do. And I could tell there was something really weird about them as they all came into the room. There was something about the body language in the conversation. I could tell people sort of had their arguments ready. They knew they were kind of in for a fight. The defensive shields were up. Because, of course, everyone's worried about, being blamed for stuff. That can be a really hard conversation to have. And you know what happens when the blame starts getting thrown around when something hasn't gone right? Immediately the defense screens go up, people's scope of concern narrows from sort of talking openly, honestly, what can we learn? What mistake did I make? What can we collectively learn from this? To sort of, how can I not be blamed? How can I creatively self-justify why something happened the way it did? Or, worse yet, kind of push the blame off onto somebody else? And that wasn't going to work for us. So I had to short circuit that. And I did two things. The first was I just put we had 7 values. I put an 8th one up on the wall, sort of just made it by fiat, and said, we're only going to use blame in this team in the event of gross negligence or malice. Everything else is a learning experience. I thought that sounded lovely. That was a very noble kind of goal to have. And I'm sure many of your organizations have something similar written on the wall, written in a training manual. And it's one thing to write it on the wall or in a training manual. It's another thing to do it for real and for that to be the lived reality of the people in the team. So I had to put that into action. And the way I did that was I permanently borrowed this idea off the Red Arrows, the United Kingdom Air Force, aerobatics team, an exceptional team. I mean, no one could deny that. But what they do when they debrief after an air show is exceptional. They put on what we see as a flawless display of aerobatics. They fly back, land at the airfield. The pilots grab a drink of water, still in their flight suits. They go into the debrief room, and they watch back the video of the air show they've just put on. And every time, every single debrief, and they're doing these things daily, it's the leader of that team, call sign Red One, he or she stands up in front of the rest of the pilots and points out, this is where I need to improve. This is where I should have tightened up my turn or changed the formation or passed in a different way, whatever it might be. And every single time they do that, and they plant a flag in the sand, and that says, no one needs to manage their status in this room. No one needs to creatively self-justify. Everyone can check your egos at the door. We're here to learn. We're here to make sure that we can take some lessons from the experience we've just had, so we can put on an even better executed air show next time. So in that same way, I talked to the crew. We went through all these experiences that we'd had, and I sort of each one, and it was a difficult thing to do. I was choking up a little bit before I started. I had to put myself out there and say, this is what I got wrong, this is what I contributed, this is what I learned, and this is what I think I'm going to do differently next time. And you know what? After the first one, the whole room changed. The body language changed. I could just tell people relaxing. We had the most amazing meeting. I remember, I get goosebumps now when I think about it, the energy in the room. As soon as people realized they didn't have to do any of that stuff and there was no sort of blame here, the conversation changed its tone entirely. And the energy and the ideas and suggestions, the solutions that came out of this group was phenomenal. We stayed in that meeting room the whole day, and we came up with some fantastic action points that sustained our campaign from then right through till the very end. Now, I work with a lot of organizations, sort of large and small, and the biggest blocker that I see to organizations having team resilience, being able to learn lessons from negative experiences they have, to be able to work in a sort of adaptive, agile way, is that they don't have these kind of conversations. Or rather, they can't have these conversations. They're not wired to be able to have these conversations. Because when people get into a room and they start discussing something that hasn't gone well, blame creeps in, and people immediately start thinking, what is the cost to me? If I speak up, if I talk straight, if I tell the group about something that I haven't done well, they start thinking they're going to lose their bonus, it's going to affect their professional reputation. They're just going to feel, they're going to get a hard time from their colleagues. And so they end up stuck in this blame cycle. And the systemic issues often don't get addressed until they've had some huge effect on the bottom line, that, the talent starts sort of throwing up their hands and walking out. And for the constantly changing, very uncertain world that we're living in, being able to have these conversations is absolutely crucial. So I'd offer that to you. That was the biggest learning point from that early stage of the race. And by the end, as I said, this was our single biggest competitive advantage. The other boats in this fleet just seemed to fall into the same habits, the same traps, the same patterns, leg after leg, whereas we only learn these lessons and we only learn them once.